We're going to be looking at a gospel passage from Matthew as well as an epistle lesson from the book of Galatians. And there Matthew writes, "At that time Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." And then the Apostle Paul writes from the book of Galatians, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. And again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit we eagerly await by faith the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith, expressing itself through love. You were running a good race. Who cut in on you to keep you from obeying the truth? You, my brothers and sisters, who were called to be free, but do not use your freedom then to indulge the flesh, but rather serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other." Most of us are aware, I'm sure, of the great artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci. He was quite the Renaissance man. He was interested in almost anything of consequence in this world. Let's take, for instance, his intense curiosity with birds and how they flew. And so he began to study birds and how they flew. He looked at their wings. He even created helicopters and parachutes and these flying machines years and years and decades and hundreds of years ago. He did all of this. He did this by looking at the anatomy of a flying bird. In fact, the freedom of their movements, birds, seems to almost be sort of a metaphor for Leonardo da Vinci's life. He observed, for instance, that a mother goldfinch, seeing her babies caught and put in a cage, would actually then go to her babies and feed them a poisonous plant. What a mystery. Why would that bird do that? Da Vinci explained by saying, better death than to be without freedom. And as a result, in the course of his frequent journeys into the streets of Florence there in Italy, Da Vinci would often encounter merchants who would be selling birds in cages. And so frequently he would stop and he would pay the purchase price for these birds. And then he would open the doors of the cage and he would release these birds into the endless blue sky. Such was his passion for freedom. Well, folks, I hope that as you are celebrating this Independence Day weekend, that you have given some thought to the passion for freedom that some of our forefathers and mothers devoted their lives to in creating this nation. And I hope that as you as well ponder the example of a man like Leonardo da Vinci, that you will remember a man who bought caged birds and then set them free so that in doing so, he had purchased their freedom for them. Today we remember Jesus, who paid the ultimate price, who purchased our freedom so that we might be free. Our text, I think, this morning is a perfect one for this holiday weekend. We get some time off. We get a chance to relax. I was thinking about a woman who opened her refrigerator door. And when she did, she saw, strangely enough, a rabbit sitting on one of the shelves, Tom. What would you do if a rabbit was sitting on the shelf of your refrigerator? So she said to the rabbit, what are you doing in there? And unexpectedly, the rabbit replied, "This is a Westinghouse, isn't it?" For those of you who are old enough to remember Westinghouse appliances, he said, "This is a Westinghouse, isn't it?" The woman said, "Well, yes." Well, he said, "I'm Westing." I know that's a really bad joke. Well, Westing, or shall I say resting, I think is what today's text, it was what our prayer for today as well is all about. Jesus says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burdens are light." Yeah. Folks, just like that wascally wabbit there in that refrigerator, here's a promise that many of us need to hear today. We are tired and we need rest or rest. Some of us are tired, I think, maybe because we work too hard. You know, Time magazine reminds us that back in the 1960s, expert testimony was given to the Senate subcommittee on time management. And these so-called experts predicted that advances in technology were going to come around that would radically change how many hours a week that you and I would have to work. They forecasted way back then, over 50 years ago now, that the average American would only have to work 22 hours a week. Well, the great challenge that the so-called experts brought forth was going to be figuring out what to do with all of our excess time. So 50 years after that prediction was made, how many of you are wondering what to do with all of the excess time that you have on your hands, right? You know, apparently in China, the polite answer to the question of "how are you" is to say, "I'm very busy. Thank you." Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Not just in China. Isn't that how we measure our lives? And because we've made an idol out of busyness, we're tired. Some of us are tired because we work so much, and others because we worry so much. I mean, after all, isn't a lot of fatigue mental? Yeah. Our bodies are tired. Not because our bodies have been too active, but because our minds are in overdrive, dealing with all of the fear and the anxiety and the stress. And sure, when we look at things today, unlike decades ago, most of us don't have jobs that are so much about all this physical work, but rather a kind of stress that is mental and emotional. Someone has said that no one collapses because of the burdens of today, but rather it's when the burdens of tomorrow are added to the burdens of today that a person begins to crumble. Folks, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands today if you feel stressed out because of your work or over family concerns or maybe because of your health or whatever may be weighing you down today. But the estimates are that at least 80% of Americans are under at least a moderate amount of stress. To a great extent, fatigue is mental. Some of us are working too hard, and some of us are worrying too much. And how many of us are sleep deprived? The great evangelist D.T. Miles tells of traveling by train a number of decades ago, even then, across India. It was a long trip. And so from time to time he needed to sleep, but he was so worried about getting his suitcase stolen that he found he had a hard time sleeping. And so he put it on a rack over his head so he could keep an eye on it, but still all he could manage to do was to doze. He had to watch that darn suitcase. But finally he grew so exhausted that he fell asleep. He slept too long, and when he woke up, sure enough, his suitcase, it had been stolen. Although an interesting thing happened after that. It was then that finally he could sleep because he had nothing to watch. Folks, you know, there's something about a troubled mind that can rob us of our sleep, can't it? For many of us, it's a serious problem. In fact, next to alcohol, sleep deprivation is the number one cause of serious accidents in America. Let's take the family that went to New York City for the first time. They were dazzled by all the sights and by all the crowds. And so the dad said, "This is certainly the city that never sleeps." He said this to his 11-year-old daughter, and she said, "Yeah, it's probably because there's a Starbucks on every corner." Folks, some of us are running on caffeine. And we are blowing right through all of the warning signs. And then we come once more to the words of the Master. "Come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Folks, that's one thing that I think we are longing for this morning, especially on a holiday weekend, isn't it? We want rest. And where is true rest and peace to be found? It comes from good and right relationships. Have you ever been in a wrong relationship? Yeah, it's the least restful state of anything that we'll ever know on this earth. Yeah, when our relationships, though, are right, then everything is right. But when they're wrong, there is no rest, there is no peace. But a right relationship, that brings us rest. Well, in today's lesson, Jesus, he claims that the ultimate rest, the longing of every human heart for the most right of all relationships, comes through being in relationship with Him. You want rest, he says. Well, I'm the rest maker. And folks, what I love about Jesus' invitation here is not just to who he invites, but to what he invites us to. Jesus doesn't just invite those who've got it all together. He invites the stressed out, the struggling, the tempest tossed. And dare we say these words on this holiday weekend, the words that greeted so many people as they came into the New York harbor and they saw the Statue of Liberty, and they soon became Americans as they sailed into that harbor. Could these words be words that Jesus would say when he said, "Give me your tired, your weary, your huddled masses yearning to be set free"? Yeah, I love whom Jesus invites, but also to what he invites us. He says to us, and I will give you rest. And folks, perhaps as you hear these words this morning, perhaps you imagine in your mind a vacation destination or a new recliner or relaxing massage or that commercial, Calgon, take me away. You imagine all that, but instead, what we find today is not those things, but in what Jesus says to us, we find a work order. Take my yoke upon you. Does any of us know what a yoke is? I mean, these days we can't assume that people know what a yoke is. A yoke is an instrument for work. It's a wooden frame that's placed upon the shoulders in order to make a load or a burden easier to carry, and is designed to sort of distribute the weight in equal proportions to both sides then of the body. And do you see the paradox here? For what yoke is ever comfortable? What burden is ever light? Jesus doesn't promise us an escape from reality when we follow him. When those who were baptized this morning, when I met with them, I made sure that they understood that following him is not a cakewalk. It's about the resurrection, but it's also following Jesus in his sufferings. But Jesus, in doing that, promises us the right equipment to deal with it. He promises us a yoke. Take my yoke upon you, he says, and learn from me. So apparently this yoke has to do with Jesus' teachings, but as we know full well, Jesus' teachings were not like the heavy burdens that the scribes and the Pharisees tried to hang around people's necks. His teachings bring rest. And that means, strangely enough, rest comes from working. Rest comes from laboring. Rest comes from obedience. Folks, Jesus didn't say, take my lazy boy lounger upon yourself. He didn't say, take my Serta sleeper mattress upon yourself. Those are equipment for sitting and sleeping. No, he said, take my yoke. Because you're going to be working. You're going to be walking. You're going to be moving. You're going to be carrying what I tell you to carry, even across. Yeah, life may not be comfortable. It may be hard. And trying, irony of ironies, when you walk the way that I tell you to walk, you will find rest that comes from working for me. So friends, again, what I love about Jesus' invitation here is whom he invites and to what he invites us to. Are you tired of living in bondage, of not being free, of working for whomever or for whatever? Then Jesus says, come and work for me. Put my yoke upon you. Give it a try and see if learning from me will give you rest. In our lesson for today, we learn from the Galatians. And the book of Galatians was written as a cry of freedom. Paul had preached a message of grace to the Galatians. But a group called the Judaizers, Jewish Christians, had infiltrated the Galatian church, and so they were trying to put a yoke of slavery back on the Galatians, to try to get them to fulfill the law. So all the men in the congregation, just like the Jews before them, were supposed to be circumcised. and had to fulfill all the law. The weight of that yoke was down upon them. And so people in the church, they were trying to out-impress each other with all of their works, to try to outdo each other. It was stressful. There was no rest. And today, we get to see legalism in the church of our day. Max Anders writes in his book about Galatians, even today, the Galatian error is repeated when people say, this is what you have to do to be saved. Join our church, obey our rules, submit to our baptism, practice our liturgy, worship the way we do, work hard, prove your worth, and earn God's love. And in the end, if you are good enough, God will accept you. A works-based gospel is no gospel at all. Can I hear an amen? So Paul says to the Galatians, you were running such a good race. Who cut in on you? Who boxed you in? That was a congregation under stress. I hope you don't feel that kind of stress in your faith life, folks. The gospel is a gospel of grace that Jesus offers to us, which sets us free. The Galatians were taking the weight of the world upon their shoulders. And perhaps you remember the Greek god Atlas. In the old myths, Atlas offended the king of the gods, Zeus. And for punishment, Zeus made Atlas, for all of eternity, carry the weight of the world literally on his shoulders. It was about as harsh of a punishment as the Greek mind could ever begin to conjure up. And one of my favorite authors, a man by the name of Rabbi Harold Kushner, he relates this ancient myth to us. He says, today it seems we volunteered to play the role of Atlas, but we haven't offended God. We've simply dismissed him, and we've told him we're grown up enough not to need his help anymore. We've offered to carry the weight of the world on our own shoulders, and the question is, when it gets too heavy to bear and there are questions too hard to answer and problems too hard to solve, will we be too proud to admit that we've made a mistake in wanting to carry this world all by our lonesome? That was the Galatians. Folks, like the Galatians, if you and I are going to insist on carrying the weight of the world around on our shoulders, then we're going to be very tired, very stressed out, very grouchy individuals. But the wisest people are those who leave some of the problems of the universe for God to worry about. And maybe that's why the word worry appears only 13 times in the entire Bible. Compare that with the word trust. It shows up 126 times. Or faith, 270 times. Or believe, 226 times. Or love, which shows up a whopping 551 times. And if you want to narrow it down even more, of the 13 times that worry is used, 11 times we are told not to worry. And of the other two, one asks us, why do you worry? And the other one says, tomorrow will worry enough for itself. And knowing all that, I guess the question is, how could you not take Jesus up on his offer? Will you take up his yoke? After all, how heavy is all that junk you're carrying around? Has your education brought you rest? Has climbing the corporate ladder brought you rest? Has any of the stuff that you keep buying bought you rest? Has any of it really brought you rest? Folks, following Jesus is the hardest thing that you will ever do. There's a yoke, and you must follow his way. And there's a burden, this stuff that you must carry. persecutions and trials and testing and a cross. And I'm here to tell you today, it works. Such a relationship with Jesus is right. It brings rest. The rest that we long for. And the question is, will we lay down our burdens and take up his yoke? We have a choice. Will we do it or not? Let's pray. Lord, like the old song, may we decide now to follow Jesus when there is no turning back. May we commit our lives to taking up your yoke, and in that might we find rest. We give you thanks for that in Jesus' name.